Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmageti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our subject today is my relationship with God. Last month, there was a Vedanta conference held in Huntsville, Alabama, which was attended by more than 400 students of Vedanta, some 14 monastics, monks and nuns from different Vedanta societies. It was a big gathering. And I got a chance to attend that. I'd never been to Alabama before, so that was one more state I added to my list. Eventually, I don't know how many of these 50 states I will get to see. So the conference itself was on the three basic schools of philosophy in Vedanta: dualism, qualified non-dualism, and non-dualism. And the topics were quite intimidating in some ways when you say, oh, it's a philosophical conference and so on. But it quickly became apparent as the talks proceeded and the discussions proceeded that however nerdy the subjects might seem, that essentially it was about one's relationship with God. That's what all these philosophical concepts boil down to. The kind of language you and I can understand in a common language would be, how am I related with God? We know that building bridges is important in life. We understand the value of relationships. And so people do have these networks of friends and family and so on. In spiritual life, there's a different kind of relationship one wants to develop, a relationship with God. And God, of course, is a very generic term, as we have seen, and the same transcendent being in whichever name or form that we are able to connect with. Among all of the relationships we have had in life, and not just speaking about people, relationship with ideas or with places and food and all kinds of things. All of those relationships keep changing or they keep on, they are limited in many different ways. But in spiritual life, we quickly realize that the one unchanging factor in our life, which will not be diminished by time, which will not change with place, is our relationship with God. And therefore, how one relates to God is one of the most important things if we have to grow and develop our spiritual life. There is a lot of speculation about how even the idea of God or the idea of religion may have entered into human consciousness. There are at least two theories about it. One is what today gets understood as ancestor worship. And surely one of the ways of understanding that is when we know that living beings, not just human beings, any living creature, is born at some point and grows, develops, passes through the different stages of life, and there is such thing as death. And so that theory says it's possible that at some point this question came into the human mind: where do these people who are living and moving with me, what happens after death? Where do they really go? And different ways of thinking developed from that. Some believed that after death, these people went to a higher realm. They were not constricted with the kind of limitations you and I have. And in some form, that these departed souls uh, are looking after us, taking care of us, protecting us. So many of these ancient forms of worship took the form of really what we call their ancestor worship. And then, as the human mind began to think about it further, like where do these departed souls go? Then who coordinates all this activity? Is there anything above them? And that may have been one way the idea, the religious awareness, and the idea that there may be someone, some things beyond which is controlling this whole phenomenon called birth and death. The second theory, and these are not mutually exclusive, they could be a complement to each other. The second theory is about looking at these various, especially these huge events in nature, the cycle of seasons, that rain coming. I mean, before modern science came around, at some point, not even modern science, as we understand it, came around and gave us a more materialistic understanding of how rain comes, how storms occur, why earthquakes occur. But to that, in prehistoric time, for people who are looking, they just think this is the enormous powers of nature being unleashed, either through rain, storm, fire, earthquake, and of course, heat, light, all of these things. That what this just accidental, that just things happening at random, which somehow seems to support and help the this planet or this world. Again, I think when the ancients probably, if they use the word world, that must have been a very limited sense. Um, in any case, they began to personify these powers of nature. That rain did not just fall, that there was something behind that which controlled the phenomenon of rain or of fire or earthquake and so on. And so this personification of the power of nature, and so some of these ancient ideas about gods was these powers which controlled the various facets of nature. And then, of course, again, this idea developed further and say, well, is there any power that controls all these powers? So in one way or another, somehow this notion about that there being something more to life than what meets the eye. A purely materialistic position is clearly this is all the world that we have. The atoms, molecules, power, energy that we understand, what is quantifiable, what is measurable, that is all the world there is. And there is no such thing as beyond. That's a very materialistic position. But if one doesn't limit oneself to that, then one sees that no, there must be something beyond this. If our true, who we are, is just limited to just atoms and molecules, and everything is just matter, and just things have come together accidentally, and yes, the world is a mess, but in this mess, there seems to be like some kind of an order, some kind of a rule, some kind. So to think about it as just pointless, meaningless in some way, makes human life just devoid of any purpose and meaning. And while some people, a few at least, may be there who truly believe it that way, human beings in general want to see a deeper purpose and meaning behind everything. And so that may have been also the reason why people began to think about life an existence beyond the one that we are accustomed to. And so it's possible to merge these two theories of ancestor worship and personification of the powers of nature. And Swami Vivekananda said one way to think about it is the urge in the human heart to transcend, to go beyond the limitations that we have. So when we look deeply, we see that no matter how free we might feel ourselves to be, at a very subtle level, there are certain boundaries within which our whole existence seems to be limited at present. First of all, there is the limit of time. We can talk about going beyond time, but that really doesn't mean anything beyond just putting words intelligently. It's like your large language model, LLMs. They seem to be making sense, but and nowadays there's a big question about are they conscious and so on. But essentially, they just are putting words together. So we might talk about going beyond time, but what does that even mean? Our mind is incapable of thinking beyond this notion of past, present, and future. As far as time is concerned, we do operate within that paradigm. Similarly, going beyond the idea of space. Again, it's simply an idea, simply just words put together. But through the mind, we have no idea what it means to be not constricted by the spatial world in which we live. And then connected with these two is the idea of cause and effect, that no matter what happens, it must have had some cause. Everything is an effect of something, and in turn might become a cause of something else. And cause and effect is also connected with the idea of time. The cause is always that which comes before, effect is what comes later. And so the mind is a great instrument that we have. It has done and it will continue to do amazing things, but it is operating within this domain of time, space, and causality. And so once we kind of become aware of that, then the next obvious question is there anything beyond time, anything beyond space, or that's just the bubble in which we have to live through eternity? So all of these questions come up. And at the heart of these questions is really, all of us are aware of our own personal existence. We may not, if you study Vedanta, we might say, well, I don't know exactly truly who I am, but we know I am. I am a person. And then we'll encounter this world, this thing, this whole world that exists. I exist in the world. And then we wonder whether there's anything beyond this. And if there is anything or anyone beyond the world, what is my connection with that? Because it's not enough, because sometimes we might think, oh, it's enough to know who I am. But all of us, unless we are suffering from extreme amnesia or something, we always have an answer to the question, who are you? So we do know who we are. Of course, when we read books like the Vedanta and some of these philosophies, they might say, no, you are not really who you think you are. There is a deeper truth within me. Okay, but then still there is a question, I as I am now, how is I as I am now related to that I who I truly am? What is the relationship between the real me and my present me? Or if we think about it in a theistic way, that there is a divine presence behind this whole creation, then I as I am now, how am I connected with that divine presence which is beyond this creation? Am I connected or not? Because if I'm not connected in any way, then again, that's as pointless as anything. And so all of these kind of questions come, that yes, God created the world, But what happened after that? Is God just kind of left us to our own devices now, figure out what to do? Or is God continuing to help, support, and guide us? Now, it's not as if there are no answers, but there are plenty of answers. And the different answers that have come to these questions have taken the form of different religious traditions. And some of these answers might resonate with us, some of the answers might say, well, who knows? And some of the answers may make no sense at all. Possible, because the questions are not different, but the answers are very varied. And the only way to know for ourselves that whichever answer makes sense to us intellectually is really true is just to experience it. It's like if there is a new coffee shop has come and then someone tells you, you read all the reviews about it and say, some people say it's great, some people say not so great, some people say it's terrible. And well, some of these reviews might be more persuasive than others. And some people might be just satisfied reading the reviews. But someone might say, no, I just want to go and verify for myself whether that coffee is really good or not. And then I have to go and experiencing it myself. So even when we read and understand what these different religious traditions throughout history have been telling us, and we exactly the same way, although coffee just seems like a very trivial example, but it's a little bit not too different from it. That yes, there are these questions, there are all these answers. Some answers will make sense, some won't. But then the final verification or confirmation of what is really out there, we just have to discover it for ourselves. And that is where these different, what we speak about as different philosophies come in. So the different philosophical schools in Vedanta, there are many. Of course, the tradition has been around now for centuries, at least 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, maybe longer. And so it's not surprising that there are many different schools of thought. But it's possible to categorize them in at least 3 baskets. And all of these 3 connect or are related to our relationship with God. So one way of thinking about our relationship with God is that, yes, God exists. All of these schools of thought assume. If someone says God doesn't exist, then well, there is nobody to have relationship with. So when we speak about relationship, it's kind of accepting that I exist, God exists, now to try to figure out how we are connected. And so the one way of thinking about that is that first, we are connected. And that connection is, let's say, like the connection between a parent and their child. And we know, we are aware of that kind of connection in our own experience. We have parents. We know what it means to be connected with a parent. And that's why it's quite common to think of God as our Father, the Divine Father or Divine Mother. And that's one way of relationship with God. The kind of relationship is a parent and a child. They are connected, but they are different. A parent is not the same as the child. And so that's one way of relating. And because they are different, this way of thinking or any kind of a relationship where the 2 involved individuals remain separate, although connected, that is what is called dualism. In Sanskrit, it's called Dvaita. Now, another way of connecting with the divine would be, yes, we are different, but not totally different. We are different, but it's almost like being a part of each other. It's like, yes, parent and children are different, but yet they're part of a family. So if you think of family as a unit, then the family is one, but there are separate individual members of that family. Or you can think about a tree. One tree. A tree is a one entity. But within that tree, you find there are branches, there is a trunk of the tree, there are the leaves, there are the flowers, there are the fruits, and all taken together forms one tree. So there is this oneness as a tree, and yet these internal differences within the different parts of the tree. So that's a second way of connecting with the divine. That yes, I am a part of the divine. The divine is this whole, and I am a tiny part of the divine. And so this is kind of an interim step when you are neither totally different nor completely one. And so this is the second way of the second basket, if you like. This is called Vishishta Advaita, or Vishishta means qualified. So it's non-dual, but it's not complete non-dual. It's a little bit qualified in the sense that there are internal differences. So actually, you can even call it qualified dualism, either way. And then there is, of course, the third basket, where it is said that even though it might appear as if this divine presence and my own little presence are two separate, that's only an appearance. In reality, it's just one. They are not two different. And that's non-dualism or Advaita. Now, although this seems like a very neatly separated three ways of thinking, that's why I use the word basket, there are a lot more nuanced variations. So there are not just like one kind of non-dualism. Although one might say, well, if it's non-dual, how can you have differences? But yes, even within non-dualism, there are different ways of affirming that non-dualism. And of course, dualism, there are different ways of, and which is why, for instance, we think about among the dualists, the different godheads that exist. So there are worshippers of Shiva, the worshippers of Vishnu and the Devi, and the different ways the divine is seen in different forms and different ideas and different qualities. So dualism, clearly it's understandable that takes many different forms in actual practice. Vishishtadvaita, or the qualified dualism or non-dualism, also takes many different forms. And of course, non-dualism, surprisingly, also there are shades of different non-dualism. We are not going to go into all those technicalities, but it's enough to know that there are these three different major ways of doing it. Now, these ideas have existed for centuries in the Vedantic tradition, and in a general, really, in spirituality in general as well. Now, there are some names have become very prominent in Vedanta, associated with these three different ways of thinking. And they have become prominent because although teachers and thinkers have had these, presented these ideas for centuries, these three names have kind of become personified in some ways as the representative of these three baskets, because they were extraordinary beings, all of them very enlightened, and then they wrote very extensive commentaries on these basic texts of Vedanta. There is the Gita, then there are the Upanishads, and then there is a text called the Brahma Sutra. Those are considered the foundational texts. In Sanskrit, they call it Prasthanatraya. And there has been this long-standing tradition that if anyone writes learned commentaries on these three texts, then they are called acharyas. Now, it's not just a scholarly work. To be considered an acharya means not only that you have a deep knowledge of the scriptures, the subtlest layers of meaning of the scriptures, but that you have actually experienced it. So it's not simply intellectual. It's something very experiential. And so there are many teachers, of course, who have had these experiences, but these three now have become emblematic of these three different baskets. So Madhvacharya, probably, I think, 13th century, is is considered the representative of the dualistic schools of thought, Ramanujacharya of this Vishishtadvaita, and Shankaracharya of the Advaita schools. And you can see there is Acharya appended to their names. Of course, they were not named when they were born. Yes, you're an Acharya. I mean, anybody can be, if you're inventive enough, there are now children are named Rishis, Rishi and Acharya. But it's good to be named like that, but it points to an ideal. But then to live up to that ideal, we actually have to then do what our name represents. And that was, in some ways, the hope and the idea, at least in the way naming used to be done in ancient times, that whoever was named, the idea was it will represent some ideal that would be a reminder then to the person, like, oh, this is my name that my parents gave me, and this is what it means, and this is what I should strive for. It's certainly of course, Tyagananda is not the name my parents gave me. It was given by my teacher when I was given sannyas. And that's how we see it. And I don't get to choose my name. And so whichever name the teacher gives is seen in the tradition as, well, that's the ideal the teacher wants me to strive for. And so similarly, it might be helpful, depending on whatever name we have, and if it means something connected with spiritual life, like I would like to live up to that ideal. And so the name Acharya means someone who is enlightened, someone who knows the scriptures, and someone who can teach that scripture or impart those ideas in an authentic way. And so these three teachers have presented these commentaries, one of them saying that God and me are completely separate. The second one saying we are separate, but we are parts of each other. And a third one saying, no, we are not separate, we're just one. The question is, how can all three be correct at the same time? Because that's whenever we see or meet with differences or different answers, the obvious question is, which of them is right? And that's not a question easy to answer. What has been done so far? Well, for centuries, the people who had these, because as I said before, some of the questions are going to resonate with us, some may not. And so that's been the situation all through history. So those who have became like, this answer makes sense to me, or this doesn't make sense to me, and so on. There was a good section of people among them, everyone trying to show the way I think is the right way. The other ways are wrong. And that kind of a dialectic has occurred. The non-dualist saying, oh, that doesn't make sense, that's not right, and the other people saying, this is not right. Oddly enough, that way of pointing out the loopholes in the other philosophy and affirming the truth of one's own philosophy ended up making all these philosophies very strong. Because essentially what happens is, let's say one of these, say, just as an example, if the dualists then point out some loopholes in the way a non-dualist thinks and says, this is what you're saying doesn't make sense, then the natural response is to then find a way to answer that, saying, no, what you think is a loophole is not really a loophole. This is the way to think about it. And then in kind of a counterpoint, there is a loophole in yours. And then that person then says, no, what you think is a loophole is actually should be thought this way. And so enormous Vedanta literature has developed with this point and counterpoint. One group finding out defects in the others then answering that, saying that's not a defect and pointing out why it is not a defect. and then pointing out. So each of these philosophies today has become pretty robust because they have over the centuries answered so many questions from the opposing schools of thought that today if any of us feel I'm going to raise a question they are not going to have an answer to, chances are very less. It will be very difficult to raise any original questions at this point because for centuries, lots of questions have been asked and lots of answers have been given. And so intellectually, it's very difficult to know who is right and who is wrong. Yes, emotionally, we might feel connected with one or the other of these. But intellectually, it may not be so easy. One might say, I don't agree with this, but then for many of us, our knowledge of any of these philosophies is pretty superficial. If you kind of dig deep, and many of us probably don't have the time or the interest to do that. But they are pretty robust philosophies. And so the one way was to think that one of them is right, the others are wrong. If someone could have conclusively proved that, then that which is wrong would not have survived. But as it stands today, all of these things are, all of three schools are thriving. And so no one really has been able to prove anyone totally wrong. Then the other way to do that, so if exclusivity doesn't work, then maybe inclusivity will work. To say that you're right, but I'm more right. Like there is a partial truth in what you're saying, but gradually, if you look deeper, then eventually you will begin to look at the way the I am looking. So that's the kind of an inclusivistic approach. Sometimes they call it the teleological approach. It's almost like a ladder that we don't say only one step in a stair or this thing is useful. We know that if you need to go up a ladder, every step is important. It's needed. If you want to go up, you can't say this is the lowest one, I don't need it. No, you'll need it to then step on to the next step, to the next step. And so some people have seen that. And then the most popular way to think about this ladder imagery is to say dualists, that's the first stage in spiritual life. And then when you evolve a little, then you become Vishishtadvaita. And then, of course, you are completely highest. Of course, then that is Advaita or non-dualism. And of course, human nature is, if you go to buy something and you say, this is a low quality, this is high quality, and if you can afford it, of course you want the best quality. Why would anyone want? And so it's natural, there's this tendency, so if that's the best and if that's the ultimate, that's who I am. I don't want these lower things. The problem with this way of thinking is that a ladder can be put both ways. You can upside down. And in fact, others have done it. And so it's not so simple as to say, oh, the dualism is the lowest stage and non-dualism the highest. Also, there is another popular idea connected with it, and that is that by default, everyone is a dualist, unless they do something to look deeper and then think about these higher thoughts. Actually, that's not true. By default, everyone is a materialist. It's tough to be a dualist. What does a dualist say? Yes, God is separate, I am separate. But before you go to the word separate, God is. That I am, that we all know. We are aware of our existence, and which is why we go and we have a bunch of things to do every day. But how often in the course of a day do any of us remember God is, God exists? Maybe the few minutes that we pray and meditate, hopefully at least that time we try to affirm God's presence. But then as we get engaged in our day-to-day activity, how often in the course of a day do I remember God exists? And if I don't do that, I'm not even a dualist. So let's not delude ourselves into thinking I don't have to do anything to be a dualist. No, there's a lot to do. And of course, once I'm a dualist, then there is the other question of how I see myself. And so that is the second popular notion we have to get rid of, that somehow we don't need to do anything for dualism. It's only for these other things we need to do a lot. Not true. And so whichever way we place the ladder, the it's never going to be satisfactory to all, because it's always going to be like whichever is the highest. For instance, if you say dualism first step, Advaita is the non-step. Advaitins like the idea. Of course, they are on the topmost level. And so I don't think it produces harmony socially, collectively. People can keep on arguing all the time that mine is the best and so on. A real harmony, I would think, would come not in fighting with these different ways of thinking, but then looking in our own heart and say, yes, it's good to be acquainted with how people before us have thought about these things, but then say, right now, how do I think about God? What is my idea about myself? What is my idea about God? Now, sometimes, again, as I mentioned earlier, God is a very generic term. So oftentimes for most of us, the word God may get, unless a kind of a very hazy, a vaporous notion about God, for most of us, God becomes a little bit more particularized with a certain qualities associated with God, or sometimes even a form associated with what we in Vedanta we just say Ishta, a favored form of the divine. But by form, I don't necessarily mean in terms of the visual form, but that means the way I like to think of God. For the mind to be able to think of God, God must become tangible in some way. Because otherwise, it's a very abstract idea. When you say, oh, God is infinite, God is loving, it conveys some idea. But even the idea of love is quite abstract. We can understand love, what love means. What comes before our mind is some person or something in life where we have actually seen the manifestation of love. And so to think about God in a meaningful sort of way, it has to become concretized in some way, either in a form of a symbol or some qualities. Again, it has varied from people to people. And so what each of us might be better off doing is saying, this is who I am. This is the way of thinking of the divine that resonates with me. And asking myself, how am I connected with that divine? Because remember, that's how this whole thing began, about what happens after death. It's just a mystery. And in many religious traditions, they believe that in some form, in some way, at least the ultimate goal of our life is meeting with the divine, meeting with the Creator, meeting with that ultimate presence. And of course, we meet with that ultimate presence. We want that presence to recognize us. I was just thinking when we were doing the song in the beginning, that it's a beautiful song, In the Garden. It's one of my favorite songs. That, for instance, those who are students and devotees of the life of Ramakrishna and Holy Mother, it would be wonderful. You're walking in the garden at Dakshineshwar, and Ramakrishna or Holy Mother holding our hands and walking. Now, whichever way, again, you can think about the Buddha, you can think about Jesus, you can think about any being who brings that idea of the divine in the heart. So what we might think, And again, everybody will think in their own way. This is not the, just walking in the garden is not the only way to establish a connection and a relationship. But we would want that divine presence to recognize us, that I somehow feel that connection, there is that. And a practical way would be not to think in terms of whether dualism is right or non-dualism is right, because it's unresolvable other than just debate and argumentation. The more practical way is to think, at present, this is how I think of myself. At present, this is my idea of the divine. And at present, this is how I feel connected, or I would like to feel connected. And then see, what should I be doing right now in order to strengthen that connection, strengthen that relationship. Also, to not be dogmatic enough to say, the way I think of myself now, that's the final answer. The way I think about God, that's the final answer. None of us knows what the final answer is. So all of the answers we have are very provisional, and it's good to keep it provisional. That's what even in science they do. Yes, sure, you have theories, you do some experimentation, you have some expectation that a certain result will come. Good, but keep the possibility open that when I actually do that experiment, something very different might occur. All great inventions and discoveries have happened that way. They thought something will happen and something totally different happened. So yes, right now we might have our own answers about who we are, who God is, even if they are hazy answers, even if we are totally confused about it. There is some understanding right now, but we can keep our hearts open to say that when I actually stand in the presence of God, God might be very different from what I had imagined. Like, whoa, this is God. We don't know. But keeping our mind open is very important. Not just in terms of when we encounter the divine presence, but even encountering different ideas. Sometimes we can get so stuck in our ways of thinking that the moment we hear someone speaking something very different or a different approach, we might think we are hearing them, but we are not, because we are just too convinced about our truth. It's good as long as we have not experienced it directly, as long as it is simply an intellectual or emotional response to things. It's good to be open. Sometimes they say it's good to be open-minded, but not so open that your brains fall out. So we should have our own convictions. I'm not saying don't have any ideas. Of course, each of us has our own ideas, but we can keep our ideas, our minds open to any new idea, new way of thinking we approach. We can then compare it with the idea that we have until that point, and perhaps this new way of thinking might enrich our understanding, or perhaps we might have to revise our understanding to some way. But only if we are open to the possibility, then this kind of growing is possible. So one way of praying, again, one way that is good is, there are many kinds of prayers and people pray in different ways, and all of those ways are effective and wonderful. But even in that prayer, it might be if we can add a little bit and say, God, I really don't know how you are, who you are. I'm trying in my own little way to try to figure it out. Whenever the time comes, whenever is the right time for you to reveal yourself in a way I can understand you, in a way that will make sense to me, in a way that I feel whole in some way. And it's quite likely that when we actually experience the divine, we may not want to then pigeonhole it, oh, that's dualism or non-dualism. I think the real presence of God is neither dualistic nor non-dualistic. God is neither with form nor even without form. God transcends even the notion of form. God is beyond word, beyond language. But right now, that's all that we have. We have to deal with words, we have to deal with forms, we have to deal with ideas. So we are using imperfect instruments, imperfect categories to try to grasp the perfection. We are trying to express one who is essentially inexpressible. So none of our efforts, none of our ideas are ever going to be perfect. But they are good enough for us to take us to the point where we leave all notions behind, where we transcend everything. God is beyond the intellect and even beyond emotions. That when we leave this limited body and mind behind and then stand in the presence of the divine, and that divine will defy any of the ideas we have at present. But right now, we can use what ideas make sense to us, and most importantly, not reduce spiritual life to simply some kind of a intellectualism, some kind of a just brain work, some kind of a thinking. None of that is going to help. At some point, we'll have to go beyond that. And that will happen only if whatever makes sense to us in life somehow becomes a part of our life. By part of our life I mean it informs the way we think, it informs the way we connect with our work, it informs the way we do our actions. Otherwise, it's quite possible that we read these hundreds of different books, have these great scholarly discussions, become maybe intellectually very subtle, but our daily life has no connection with what the noble thoughts we have. Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of these birds which will be flying high up in the sky, but many of them would be like looking, these vultures, all that they are looking for is some rotten piece of flesh or some dead animal so that they can go and feast on it. That shouldn't happen with our life. To have these very subtle, high, noble ideas in the head, but our daily life is just like any worldly, materialistic person. Spiritual life is meaningless if it is reduced to only reading books and listening to lectures. It becomes truly meaningful if day by day we feel that I am becoming a better person. That we look in our heart and then feel what I was 2 years ago or 5 years ago and what I am now, I'm a better person. Only then we can say that religion and spirituality are working in my life. Not simply a better read person, not simply that I have a lot more ideas. No. True spirituality would mean qualitatively, I feel deep down that I'm a better person now. Then we can say that the way I've been thinking about these things, the way I am, whatever I'm doing is really working. And so ultimately, it's about transformation of our life, transformation of our character. And that's the only way we can judge the value of our life. And it can come through dualism, it can come through non-dualism. I don't care. That the truth is, I should become first a better human being, and then when I raise myself, that clarity of mind, the purity of heart when it comes, then whatever the truth is will be revealed to us. And that's the message we get from the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Swamiji. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu.